Welcome to the deep dive. Our job is to take your source material, and today it's a pretty dense technical guide, and really pull out the critical, actionable knowledge you need. We try to skip the menu clicks and get straight to the strategy. So today we're zeroing in on data governance, specifically records management. We're using a tech guide for setting up retention schedules in Laserfiche Cloud as our base, but our mission is translation. We want to turn these step-by-step instructions into, well, real strategic insight about compliance, about retention philosophy, and the architecture you need for a solid system. It's about understanding the why, not just the how.
Exactly. We're looking past the setup screens, really. The goal is to shed light on how organizations should think about managing the whole life cycle of a record. From when it's active to when it gets locked down, through its retention period, and then what happens? Destruction. Preservation. We're digging into those decision points the software enables.
Okay, let's get into it. Starting with control, because governance, well, it always starts with who gets to make the rules, right? The system's pretty clear here. Before anyone can even define a retention role, they need specific clearance. We're talking records management privileges, RM privileges.
And that's fundamental. You absolutely need that for any kind of robust governance. Think about it. If you're setting rules that dictate when potentially legal documents get kept or destroyed, those permissions have to be tightly controlled, separate. The guide confirms this. You've got to go into repository administration, find the user, and explicitly grant them records management. It creates that essential firewall between everyday users and the compliance architects, so to speak.
Right. Separation is key. So once you've got that RM key, then you can start building the actual rule set, the retention schedule itself. That happens back at repository administration under the records section.
Yeah, and this is where the details really start to matter. Every basic retention schedule, it needs three core things. No negotiation. First, pretty obviously it needs a name. Second, the instructions. Now, this part dictates how long you keep the record. And what's interesting here, what the source highlights, is the required precision. The retention period has to be measured strictly in months.
Months.
Yeah.
Always months. That seems, well, a bit fiddly if you have a rule like keep for 7 years. Why months specifically?
Good question. It likely boils down to the audit trail and how the system calculates things internally. If everything's converted to months, it standardizes the clock. Doesn't matter if it's a 6-month schedule or a 10-year one. It makes the back-end calculations consistent, less room for error when figuring out that exact end date.
Okay. Standardization? Makes sense. And the third component?
That's the final disposition. So after those months are up, what's the record's ultimate fate?
And the options are destroy, accession, or none. That none option.
Yeah.
It sounds passive, but it carries some real weight, doesn't it?
It really does. Destroy is obvious. Accession means transferring it out, maybe to an archive. But none, as the guide points out, usually signifies permanent retention. It's the organization actively deciding, nope, we're keeping this one forever right here in the system. So none isn't passive at all. It's a permanent hold instruction.
Okay. Moving beyond just the basic keep for X month rule, what about complexity? What happens if some external event means the standard retention period just doesn't apply anymore?
Right. That's where the system offers some flexibility. It uses something called alternate instructions. Your main schedule is the default path. But these alternate instructions let specific events trigger a completely different retention schedule.
A whole different schedule, not just like pausing the clock. Why switch the entire rule set? Can you give an example where that's really necessary?
Sure, think about contracts. Maybe you have a standard schedule. Keep contracts for 7 years after they close. Pretty standard. But then, that specific contract becomes part of a lawsuit. That event, a lawsuit starting, could trigger an alternate instruction. And that instruction might point to a litigation hold schedule, which could effectively change the disposition to none or hold indefinitely until case closed. It completely overrides the original 7-year clock because the context has fundamentally changed. It's for rapid, mandatory shifts in status.
Got it. So the event isn't just a delay, it's a recategorization. That makes sense. And speaking of timing, all these retention periods, whether they're standard or alternate, they need a starting gun, a defined beginning. That sounds like the cutoff instruction you mentioned.
Exactly. Cutoff defines the precise moment a record officially enters its retention period. And the big consequence, the immediate effect of hitting cutoff. The record becomes read-only, instantly. That's the moment it transitions from a working document to an official, unchangeable record.
Wow, okay. So cutoff isn't just some date on a calendar, it's the switch flip, the point where governance really clamps down, the line between active work and regulated history.
Precisely. And the guide says cutoff can happen in a couple of main ways. It could be based on a fixed time, end of the fiscal year, end of the quarter, predictable stuff. Or it can be triggered by an event date, which could happen anytime, like when a project is marked complete, or maybe when a loan is wholly paid off, tied to an action, not just the calendar.
Okay, that covers the timing rules. Now, let's zoom out a bit to the broader settings, the ones that shape how the whole repository behaves from a compliance standpoint. We're moving into those optional but sometimes legally vital RM configurations found under the Setting tab.
Right. The first one deals with internal organization, really. It's the option for unique record series codes. This lets an organization decide if they want to enforce strict, unique naming for their main governance folders, their record series. If you turn it on, every single one needs a unique ID. Turn it off, and you could end up with duplicates or even blank codes, which, usually isn't great for clarity or compliance down the road.
Leads to ambiguity.
Okay.
Next up is a big one, especially for government or related sectors. The option to transfer or accession to the NAFARIA, the National Archives. This feels less like a system setting and more like plugging an external legal mandate directly into the software.
That's exactly what it is. If your organization has to transfer permanent records to NARA because of laws or regulations, enabling this isn't really optional. It's mandatory. It's a compliance toggle. And turning it on, it actually changes the language the system uses. The terminology shifts.
It changes the UI. Why go that far? Why not just handle the transfer mechanics in the background? Seems a bit, intrusive to change labels based on one regulation.
Well, it seems deliberate. The idea is probably to make compliance unavoidable, almost impossible to misunderstand. When you enable this NARA setting, the option for permanent disposal isn't just accession anymore. It specifically says, designate these records for transfer or accession to NARA. And maybe even more importantly, if you search for permanent records, the system relabels that search type as NARA records. It forces everyone interacting with those records to use the official regulatory language, reduces the risk of mistakes.
That is deep integration. Forces the user into that specific compliance framework. Okay, let's look at the third key option here. Allow modifications on inactive records. Now, this one feels tricky because we just established that after cutoff, records are read-only. This sounds like a contradiction or a loophole.
It is a really important nuance, yes. And it bumps up against the practical realities of managing records over long periods. The core rule still stands. The document itself, the actual file content, the scanned pages, that cannot be changed. That immutability is protected. However, this option allows certain changes specifically to the annotations and metadata associated with that locked record.
Okay, so I can't change the PDF, but I could add a sticky note annotation or maybe update a metadata field, like a contact person's name, even years after cutoff.
Exactly that. You're updating information about the record, not the substance of the record itself. But this immediately raises a governance question, doesn't it? If the whole point of cutoff is locking things down for compliance, isn't allowing any change, even just a metadata, potential risk? Could someone misuse that? Maybe change a date field or a status field after the fact, even if the document content is safe.
That's the tension right there. It feels like a balancing act. The system needs to preserve the historical record, absolutely, but there's also a need for the surrounding information, the context, to sometimes be updated or corrected.
That's exactly the tightrope it's walking. Protecting the file's integrity is paramount, but it offers this very controlled way to manage the administrative context around it. And critically, any changes made via this option would need to be rigorously audited, because yes, technically, you are altering part of the official record's descriptive information. The guide is clear, though. Enabling this setting doesn't magically give users new permissions they didn't already have. It just changes what aspects of an already accessible but locked record they might be able to edit specifically, annotations and metadata fields they could already see or edit before cutoff. It's an administrative tool, but one with clear compliance implications.
Okay, that makes sense. A necessary but carefully controlled capability. So we've defined the rules, schedules, cutoff timing, those repository-wide compliance settings. Now the big question: how do you actually apply these rules consistently across potentially thousands or millions of documents? This brings us to the structure, the architecture.
The record series, right? Yes, this is where governance meets scale. You could assign a retention schedule directly to a single document, but that's not efficient or really the intended design for large organizations. The recommended approach is to assign schedules to a record series, or RS. Think of the RS as a special type of folder, a container specifically designed for governance. It automatically applies its assigned records management properties like the retention schedule and cutoff rules to everything stored inside it.
So it's the top-level instruction container. Can you detail that hierarchy for us? How does it flow down?
It's a pretty clear but strict hierarchy. At the very top, you have the record series, RS. Below an RS, you can have a records folder. And then below that, you finally have the record itself, the actual document or file, RS, then potentially folder, then record.
Okay, simple enough. But you mentioned strict. What are the constraints?
Right.
We can't just put these anywhere.
No, and these rules are vital for keeping the governance predictable. First, the source material says the very first record series you create must be at the root level of your repository. Governance starts at the top. Second, and this one is really important for structure, you cannot mix and match certain container types within the same parent. Specifically, you can't have a record series and a records folder sitting side by side directly under the same parent record series. You have to choose one structure type or the other for the children.
Huh. Why that specific restriction? Why can't I have a child RS for one department's records and a simple records folder for another's, both under the same main category RS?
It seems designed purely to enforce a clear, unambiguous inheritance path for the rules. If you allowed mixing, it could get confusing. Which set of rules applies? Does the folder inherit differently in the child series? By forcing you to choose either all child containers or folders, or all or subseries, it guarantees that the cutoff rules and the retention schedule set on the parent RS flow down in a perfectly consistent, predictable way to every single item underneath it, no matter how deep the structure goes. It's all about ensuring consistency automatically, especially at scale.
Predictability through structure. That makes sense. It's a core principle. Inheritance. Define the rules high up, and the system enforces them downward. And for anyone listening who manages this, the guide mentions the creation path is pretty standard. In the repository, use the More Actions button, then find Record Actions, and choose Create Record Series. Okay, that wraps up our deep dive into these records governance sources for today. We've journeyed from the basics like needing specific user privileges through the nitty-gritty of retention instructions like measuring in months and that key none option for permanent holds. We also hit the critical cutoff mechanism, the point where records become read-only, and explored those important compliance settings like narrow integration and the very careful allowance for modifying metadata on inactive records.
So putting it all together, what does this mean for you? Well, the whole structure, the record series, the folders, the records, and those strict rules about how they fit together, it's all built to automate consistency, to take human error out of the compliance equation as much as possible through that principle of inheritance. And the system designers, you can see, they had to make some very specific choices about what record integrity really means. They grappled with that inherent tension in records management. How do you balance the need for an absolutely unchangeable historical file against the practical administrative need to sometimes update the context around that file, like its metadata?
Which really brings us to a final thought for you to consider. If a record is officially locked, immutable in its content, but you're still allowed to change its metadata or add annotations, how does the system, or how should your policy, decide when that stops? At what point in a record's long life cycle, maybe after a certain number of years, or perhaps once its official retention period is technically met, even if it's being kept longer, should everything about that record, including its metadata, become truly, completely untouchable, ensuring its entire identity is as fixed as its content? Something to think about as you structure your own governance approach.